Good afternoon. I'm Wael Zayat, CEO of Engage, a Muslim Get Out the Vote organization, and the National Coordinator for the American Coalition for Syria, and somewhat of a fellow at the Middle East Institute. Great to be with all of you, and great to be back to my alma mater. I'm an MSFS graduate, did 2 amazing years here at Georgetown, and it's always good to be back. We are talking about what we have learned from the failure to promote democracy. I'm not sure we've learned much, but we have an outstanding panel here with us to examine this question. The Arab Spring came and went. We are over a decade removed from it. There's been revolutions, counter-revolutions, revolutions 2.0. The region is still in flux. Did democracy actually fail? And if not, where did it go? What led to the failures or to the challenges that we saw somewhat recently in places like Tunisia? What's happening to countries that are still contesting that question violently, including in Syria? What about states that seem to have stabilized, like Egypt and others? What about Sudan? Where will the next spark come? Is Gaza another spark? Just not under an Arab dictatorship. What's the role of the US, Europeans, the rest of the international community in not just addressing this question, but in promoting or undermining democracy in the region? So there's obviously many aspects to this. What agency do the people of the region have? Are they simply subjects of a post-colonial world? Or have they had a say in what we have seen? And when we say they, who is they? Is it just the Arabs? Is it the Arab Sunnis? Is it other actors on the ground? We talk about the divisions in the region between different groups and different ideologies. How much of that is generated from the region? How much of it is a product of foreign interference? So a lot to examine and discuss, and we have 4 outstanding scholars, professors, experts who are going to speak briefly for up to 10 minutes, I was told. And then we'll open it up for questions. And so first, the way I'm going to do it, I'm going to introduce each speaker separately, but briefly. The first speaker is Professor Emerita, Tamara Sonn, who is a professor in the history of Islam at Georgetown University. Professor, if you can come up here.
Amazingly, we're actually sort of on time, even though we got a late start. And so for that reason, I might take 11 minutes. I'll do my best. So, as you know, when this organization was founded over 20 years ago, among our objectives was to counter claims that Islam is incompatible with democracy, and hopefully to garner support for pro-democracy movements within the Muslim majority world. Countless conferences and publications over the past decades have demonstrated clearly that Islam is no more anti-democratic than any other religion, and that Muslims, like everyone else, value freedom and democracy. But Euro-American policy types held on to their old prejudices no matter what we said or no matter what happened, specifically prejudices against political Islam, as they called it, or Islamism. Western governments supported Algeria's cancellation of elections in 1992, for example, saying that the Islamists only wanted democracy as a cover for authoritarianism. The success of the 2010-2011 uprisings, the so-called Arab Spring, seemed to vindicate our claims. We thought, finally, DC will pay attention and provide support for democratization in the Muslim world. In fact, some of you might remember that when we were organizing the 2012 CSID Annual Conference, we were tempted to title the conference, do you remember this, Aswan?
We told you so.
The Arab Spring, we told you so. We literally were considering doing that. But starting exactly 1 year after the first ever democratic elections in Egypt, anti-democratic forces toppled the two Arab Spring successes. And yes, with outside interference, no question about that. Egypt's first ever democratically elected president was ousted in a military coup supported by key U.S. allies. He died in prison 6 years later. Tunisia's democracy has been replaced, as we've been talking about, with an authoritarian regime, again with critical support from key U.S. allies. Rashid Ghannouchi, the leader of Tunisia's democratic transition, was arrested, as we said earlier, exactly 1 year ago today, and has been sentenced to 3 years in prison. Outside the Arab world, Pakistan's popular democratic Prime Minister Imran Khan was ousted in 2022 in a move orchestrated by the military, which is very closely allied with the U.S. He and countless members of his party and family have been incarcerated. Imran Khan himself was recently sentenced to a total of 34 years in prison on obviously politically motivated charges. All of this without a word of protest from the U.S. In fact, despite it all, the U.S. continues to work with authoritarian regimes around the world. We used to think those policies were a result of policymakers just not knowing enough. We thought we could educate them. We thought if they knew more, they would make better policies. I hate to say how long it took for me personally to recognize that those policies were deliberate, and that promotion of democracy and human rights is not the goal of U.S. foreign policy. People who enter and survive and achieve high positions in U.S. policy circles are interested in one thing, what is euphemistically called the national interest. How to promote that is what universities train would-be policy people to do. In programs like IR and political science. No offense, Nader. No offense. People are not trained to understand the people who are affected by our policies by studying languages, history, religion, and culture. They're trained in strategies to maintain U.S. dominance wherever possible. They're not even trained to think critically about what is actually in the U.S. national interest, about what would actually promote the well-being of the general populace, about promoting the common good. Only how to devise policies to protect and promote the strategic advantage of economic interests of U.S. corporations, not U.S. people, U.S. corporations. How did this become the core interest of a set of colonies that declared independence based on their belief in inalienable human rights? How did this become the driver of foreign policy behind Reagan's shining city on the hill rhetoric? The reality is that the U.S. emerged from World War II as the world's richest and most militarily powerful country in the world, and since that time, its foreign policy has focused on maintaining that strategic advantage. That meant, and continues to mean, stymieing any efforts to undermine the system on which U.S. wealth is based, starting with communist Russia. So the State Department's first Director of Policy Planning, established after World War II, George Kennan, described the policy as preventing the USSR from challenging U.S. might. He called it containing it geographically. To the public, this was described in the Truman Doctrine as support for democracies against authoritarian threats. That's what we were all taught. That's what we believed until recently, to be deprogrammed. That's why so many people so naively continue to think that the U.S. is interested in promoting democracy and human rights. But that's not what the U.S. has actually done. Instead, we have supported any pro-Western capitalist government, no matter how undemocratic. And in fact, the U.S. has actively undermined democratic governments if they were insufficiently capitalist. No one here needs to be reminded of Operation Ajax, when the U.S. and the U.K. collaborated in overthrowing the democratically elected government of Iran in 1953, which is, of course, the root of Iran's anti-Americanism. The next year, the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of Guatemala's democratically elected president. 1960, it was Congo's Patrice Lumumba. 1963, Vietnam's Diem. 1973, Chile's Allende. The list goes on. In the 1980s, Reagan's UN ambassador, Jeane Kirkpatrick, devised a more candid version of how to go about containing socialism and protecting capitalism, more candid than Truman's promotion of democracy. According to the Kirkpatrick Doctrine, it's preferable to support anti-communist dictatorships than to support democracies that might tilt towards socialism. Kirkpatrick was key in advocating the Reagan administration's support for El Salvador's and Argentina's military dictatorships and the Nicaraguan Contras, for example. After the implosion of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, there was a brief period of wondering how to focus U.S. foreign policy now that there was no specter of the evil genie of communism. George Herbert Walker Bush even spoke of a peace dividend. That was his phrase. Now that we could focus on peaceful pursuits, maybe even learn from the most experienced soldiers of World War II. For example, President Eisenhower, who said, "Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed." This is President Eisenhower. "Those who are cold and are not clothed. The world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, and the hopes of its children." Under that first Bush administration, Colin Powell, who was then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, actually called for expanding NATO to include Russia. Both Gorbachev and his successor Yeltsin were all for it. But instead, the White House listened to the claims of IR-trained people who argued, "Oh no, this is no time to let down our militarism, especially in view of the threat of militant Islam." That's what was behind the anti-democratic policies in the Middle East that I just described. How is the U.S. national interest described today? Retired Dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and frequent political appointee Joseph Nye wrote in 1999 that the national interest is nothing more than, quote, "the set of shared priorities regarding relations with the rest of the world that would justify the unilateral use of force." Now that's nice. This is what we teach people. And since the fall of the Soviet communism, Nye said that the core focus of U.S. national interest is, wait for it, maintaining international order. Maintaining international order. That means maintaining the status quo in which the U.S. corporations are the richest and most powerful corporations on earth. And he gave credit to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright for identifying the U.S. as the indispensable nation the indispensable nation, that's a quote, for maintaining international order. That might be what they're talking about with that euphemistic rules-based order that Trita Parsi talked about. The indispensable nation, American exceptionalism. What about in the Middle East specifically? How is international order, the international system in which we can thrive? That's again a quote from Nye. How is it perceived in the Middle East? Foreign policy expert Robert Lieber wrote in 2021 that the U.S. has 4 key national interests in the Middle East: maintaining a secure supply of oil, preventing the region from falling under hostile power, support for America's allies and partners, he mentions in particular Israel and Saudi Arabia, and maintaining the old standby regional stability, that is, the status quo. Lieber said that in post-Cold War years, non-nuclear proliferation and counterterrorism had also emerged as national interests. But commitment to democracy and human rights, again I'm quoting from Lieber, he says, they receive little more than rhetorical support rather than practical support. Failure to support fledgling Arab Spring democracies is clear evidence of that. More recently, in 2022, when people expressed concern about U.S. alliances with authoritarian governments in the Gulf after the murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi by Saudi government agents, another former director of policy planning, Dennis Ross, wrote that hard power matters. Yes, the murder of Khashoggi and other human rights violations are concerning, but we need Saudi oil, he said. Therefore, and I quote, the U.S. must do what the U.S. has always done: balance values and interests. How much? 1 minute, almost done. So, what drives U.S. policy is not democracy. It's the national interest in maintaining international order, the status quo. So I'm concluding, this is Orwellian doublespeak at its best. Because ultimately no one's interests are really served by these policies, except the shareholders in the corporations that get the military, technical, and oil and gas contracts in that status quo. That status quo is what's killing thousands of people daily in our countless wars and killing our planet, and, as Eisenhower put it, killing the hopes of our children. And I'm speaking as a teacher. I talk to students who say they came to this school to learn how to make the world a better place. Instead, they learn how to promote this national interest. So what can we do about it? How can we work to promote democratic values and human rights, the real national and international interest? First, we have to recognize that success will come not because of, but despite U.S. foreign policy as it's currently formulated, which means that our hopes lie in civil society, people just like us. Second, we have to start in the U.S., and here I'll speak again as an educator, revising how we train people to make policy decisions. We have bad policy, not because policymakers don't know enough, even though they don't know enough, but because we train people to make bad policy, policy that violates the principles we claim to uphold. I'll close with another quote from Eisenhower. In a less well-known part of his 1961 warning about the military-industrial complex, he said, "The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded." So my practical advice regarding how to promote democracy: we need to bring our curricula into line with our shared values of freedom and human security. human security. Until we do, nothing will change. Thank you.